Welcome to CSIS. I'm Olga Oliker. I direct the Russia and Eurasia program here. Just by way of quick administrative announcement, in case of emergency, there are exit signs, but generally speaking, please look to me and I will tell you what we should all do. So very pleased to have this conversation about robots, Russian robots. I mean, it's like a science fiction movie from the 60s. It's great. We have Sam Bendett, who's an Associate Research Analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, where he works with the Russia Studies program, looking at Russian defense and security technology and developments. So Sam's going to present for about half an hour about unmanned, unpersoned systems. I'm going to offer a few thoughts, but Mike Kaufman will actually be our primary moderator. Mike is also at CNA, where many of you, I think, will be familiar with his work on the Russian military, Russian defense budgets, Zapad exercises, maybe soon Vostok exercises. But I don't want to hold us up any longer. So I want us to get started, so I'm going to turn the floor over to Sam.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for CSIS for hosting this event. This is a very interesting time right now to take a closer look at the subject matter of Russian military robotics, because there are so many numerous developments which are taking place in the Russian Federation. In the near future, many Russia analysts, many Russian officials are saying that the country will need military robotic systems for use on land and sea. Russia's huge territory, its extreme physical, geographical, and weather climatic conditions, and as well as a long state border, along with some of the demographic restrictions and other factors, require for the development and creation of remotely controlled and semi-autonomous systems capable of solving the tasks of protecting and defending borders of land, air, and sea. In 2014, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stated that Russia is gearing to spend up to US $9 billion on new military UAV programs through the year 2020. Since then, there have been multiple statements by Russian government officials, from President Putin to Defense Minister Shoigu and many others, that called for greater robotization of the Russian armed forces and for the investment in military robotics that would make up a significant share of the Russian military strength in the coming decades. Russian unmanned aerial vehicle industry in particular, which was very robust through the Cold War with numerous systems developed by the country's design bureaus, has been hit very hard by the collapse of Soviet Union, much like the rest of the Russian defense sector. State support for research and development, testing and evaluation shrank significantly. And despite some legacy Soviet UAVs still flying today, not much has been made or developed. As a result, the Russian defense industry and its Ministry of Defense, or MOD, are behind the world leaders in various unmanned aerial vehicle developments, behind countries like US, Israel, and even China. Therefore, Russian unmanned aerial systems are a fairly new research topic, with information becoming readily available starting around 2011-2012. Today, Russia operates many types of UAVs. Almost all are small platforms designed for information gathering, reconnaissance, observation, communication, electronic warfare, and target acquisition, or ISTAR or ISR. These are short-range, simple, relatively inexpensive, and potentially expendable machines. I have behind me a couple of them, which I'm going to briefly discuss. At the top left is Pchela. This is a Soviet legacy system. It was developed in the late 80s and served through Russian military campaigns in Chechnya all the way through Syria today. Russia designed and operates Granat Zala, which is actually made by the Kalashnikov company, Eleron 3, that's the one in the center in the middle, and Zastava small UAVs. Their payloads include light equipment, and their launch, depending on their size, could be made by hand or via catapult. Their speed ranges anywhere from 25 to 75 miles an hour, and they have a short range of up to 35 miles, with an operational ceiling of 2.5 miles or thereabouts. Russia also operates two mid-range unmanned aerial vehicles, domestically produced Orlan 10 on the left, and the Four-Post, which is a licensed production of an Israeli-made Searcher UAV. Orlan 10, in particular, has been used very widely in Russia's conflicts, having proven itself as a very capable reconnaissance and targeting platform. It has a range of up to 120 kilometers. Four-Post is currently Russia's largest UAV. It has the longest range, although it can only be used for ISR roles. Its range could be up to 250 miles. Given growing interest in UAVs across Russian military, and finally supported by government and its Ministry of Defense, Russian defense industrial sector is ushering in a revival of Russian unmanned systems development. There are numerous programs currently in existence at various stages of development and completion. There are mid to long-range designs, small quadrocopters, multi-rotor and tilt-rotor designs, micro-UAVs, and many, many others. So this slide shows an example. In fact, the one at the top left is a T-16, which is one of Russia's few combat UAVs, and everything else that you see has been presented at various exhibitions and various events that showcased Russian Defense Ministry military accomplishments. There's also widespread use of and training with unmanned aerial vehicles at platoon and company levels all across the military. Special UAV regiments are actually formed armed with Orlan and Four-Post UAVs that guard Russian maritime approaches. Of particular importance are current projects to develop domestic MALE and HALE UAVs, which are medium altitude long endurance, high altitude long endurance machines. There have been lots of discussions and announcements in the media, prototypes and models shown at various exhibitions and conferences, but actually little concrete evidence of actual technical progress until about this year. One such project is called SCOT, or Manta Ray. That's the one below. And it has been initially worked on by the MiG Design Bureau. Later, it's been taken over by the Sukhoi Design Bureau, which is going to refashion it into an entirely new machine called Охотник, or Hunter. Another project is Altius Altera prototype. That's the photograph at the top. It's a long-range UAV powered by 2 turboprop engines, and its testing and evaluation took place over the past several years, although the actual model was flown this summer. Unfortunately for Russian Defense Ministry, this particular project has been plagued by cost overruns and delays, and the actual delivery date has been pushed some time to the right. But the most significant development in Russian UAV industry is the unveiling of Orion long-range UAV that was shown at MAX 2017 Air Defense Show this summer. This mid-range concept is actually going to be first made as an ISR model for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and later will be offered as a combat UAV for the domestic and international markets. It's also interesting that this UAV is bearing a very striking resemblance to Iranian Shahed UAV used in Syria in the Middle East, although there have been no official announcements of actual cooperation between Russian and Iranian UAV industries. Other developments in Russian UAV market include a prototype fired from an RPG, that's a picture on the left, and a small UAV that could be fired from a barrel of a multiple launched rocket system. One of the most significant Russian UAV developments is the fielding of RB-341 Li-Air-3 electronic warfare system that delivers cell tower jammers via 2 or 3 Orlan 10 UAVs. This system represents a qualitative and asymmetric advantage vis-a-vis existing Western concepts, forcing U.S. military to actually replicate UAV-borne electronic warfare principles. Russian forces are training with Li-Air-3 concept and are fielding it across all of its military districts. Russian UAVs have been observed in eastern Ukraine and all across Syria. With Syria in particular, Russian military has publicly announced the use of such platforms, adding that they resulted in increased effectiveness of their forces. In fact, Moscow used UAVs more often than piloted aircraft in Syria, and is now talking about exporting its UAVs that have undergone such trial by fire. In eastern Ukraine, UAVs acted as target acquisition platforms, often to make artillery strikes more precise. In both conflicts, Russia operated small and cheap UAVs, showing that their mission could be accomplished without expensive and sophisticated UAVs currently in service with Western forces. While most Russian unmanned ground vehicles are still in the design, testing, and evaluation stages, there have already been notable presence of such machines with the country's armed forces in Syria. Uran-6, that's the image on the top left, the mining robot is a Russian version of a Croatian model and has been used by Russian sappers in Syria, helping clear recaptured areas from mines, IEDs, and unexploded ordnance. Platforma M, that's the image on the bottom right, is designed for intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. It's armed with a 7.62 millimeter machine gun and 4 grenade launchers and could be outfitted with other equipment. It is actually in service with the Russian Pacific Fleet in guard roles. Russian demining teams in Syria are now operating a Scarab unmanned ground vehicle and a Sphere, which is a baseball-sized wireless exploration drone, according to Russian and Western sources. A Sphere in particular is something that was designed for operation in hard-to-reach places or dangerous environments. In fact, similar devices have been designed by Western firms for disaster response assistance. There's already been some speculation whether Moscow-allied Syrian forces actually used armed unmanned ground vehicles in recent operations. A closer international investigation revealed that such use probably didn't take place, though numerous Russian UGVs are designed for potential use in combat. So these are some of the examples. Uran-6 larger sibling, armored Uran-9, that's the image at the top center, is armed with a variety of weapons, including a 30 millimeter cannon or a variety of machine gun and anti-tank rockets. In 2015, Russia unveiled another prototype, which is now called Vikhr, or Hurricane. That's the top left image. It is based on the BMP-3 chassis because such vehicle, a combat vehicle, is widespread across Russian armed forces, easing potential vehicle maintenance and repair. It also has its own small UAV for greater situational awareness. In 2013, Russian designers unveiled Argo unmanned ground vehicle, which could be used in amphibious operations. Another sapper UGV is called Prokhod, or Pathway. That's the image at the bottom left. It's undergone state trials by 2016. And a few years ago, one of the Russian design bureaus unveiled a UGV that's currently probably is the most cited UGV as an example, called Nerechta. That's the image at the bottom right. It's armed with a variety of weapons, including machine guns, and is designed for combat, intelligence gathering, and other duties. Actually, this particular small UGV was chosen as a research and development platform for a variety of new and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence and cooperation with unmanned aerial vehicles. This UGV has also been tested in cooperation with Ratnik personal combat system, or the newest warfighter gear that Russians are fielding. Another UGV, which is the top right corner, is called Saratnik, and that was unveiled in 2016 by Kalashnikov Design Bureau. Ministry of Defense decided not to put this particular UGV in production, but it's been used as a test bed for a variety of weapons. There are other UGVs in development, like the Mobile Autonomous Robotics System, or MARS. There's an equivalent of the Boston Dynamics Lynx biomorphic robot, which looks like a giant cat. Russians have also designed a scary-looking humanoid Fedor robot, which has been dubbed Russian Terminator. Although it was designed for civilian use, it looks really cool with 2 guns and a reference to many movies. Other developments include a virtual battlefield that was designed by the military-industrial complex in Russia for testing military robotics and drones. This virtual battlefield includes a virtual trainer simulation center and a tool for integrating other trainers and virtual models of any unmanned object. Last year, Russian military-industrial complex also announced the creation of a powerful computer for controlling air, ground, and sea-based robotic systems, offered by any manufacturer. Because numerous unmanned platforms have been currently developed, this particular computer, as the designers claim, can speak the language of all these military robots. When it comes to Russian unmanned underwater and surface vehicles, or UUVs and USVs, The vast majority of these models are still in the development, testing, and evaluation stages. These models are designed for surveillance, observation of Russia's maritime approaches, and similar duties. The country is working to replace a lot of imported underwater and surface unmanned vehicles with domestic models over the next several years. For example, Russian company Tethys Pro is set to deliver a Marlin remote-controlled unmanned submersible to the Russian Navy. It is designed to substitute a British-made Tiger remote-control vehicle. Concept M is an autonomous search and rescue submersible, which is capable of diving to the depth of about 1,000 meters. It is designed to replace an Icelandic Gavia submersibles currently in service with the Russian Defense Ministry. Russian Navy will soon be equipped with underwater glider 2.0 robots. These are the two models at the top, which will be able to perform search and rescue operations as well as surveillance and mapping duties for up to 6 or 9 months without interruption. In normal mode, these particular models move at the principle of an underwater glider, changing its own buoyancy. Inside the drone is a powerful pump and a tank into which the water is pumped. A fully filled ballast tank makes the drone heavier and it begins to sink. Then it pumps the water out and it rises. So essentially travels in a wave motion. So it can cover a short horizontal distance for every descent and ascent. There's a Sea Shadow autonomous unmanned underwater glider, which is designed for oceanic research. The Sea Shadow can stay in the water for up to 6 months as well. And this UUV is in demand for problem solving related to the use of precision weapons by surface and submarine forces. A famous Russian submarine design bureau is currently working on a drone, according to many sources, which is called Surrogat, which would be able to realistically imitate and reproduce the physical fields of the enemy submarines and other vessels. There was also a lot of attention last year to the news that Russia conducted a test of a revolutionary nuclear-capable submarine that poses a major strategic threat to the U.S. ports and harbors, dubbed Canyon. We haven't seen much follow-up in the news about that. Russia is also using imported unmanned surface vehicles, such as the Inspector MK in the center, as a multi-purpose USV platform, but domestic designers are also currently working to replace that. There are other sea-based developments that include many models that can dive to the depth of anywhere from 1,000 to 6,000 meters and can operate for very long distances. What is also significant about Russian unmanned underwater development is the current emphasis on Arctic exploration. To that end, various developments aim to advance Russia's existing maritime capabilities deeper and farther from shore. For example, small underwater swarms, which could be launched by hand, are currently in development. Russian designers are also working on underwater energy station. That's the image at the bottom right. Essentially a portable nuclear power. It can stay underwater for up to 8,000 hours or 30 years. Another possible design is a catamaran underwater transport, which can deliver various cargo and even conduct limited repair of various underwater objects. Unmanned underwater systems will also feature prominently in future Russian submarine development. Current plans for a 5th-generation nuclear submarine, codenamed Husky, will incorporate unmanned underwater vehicles into its design and operations. So I'd like to put all this in perspective. The United States has a highly advanced and sophisticated system for the development of unmanned technologies for the military. It's got various research laboratories in various services like the Army Research Lab, the Navy Research Lab. The Department of Defense sponsors research institutions like the Office of Net Assessment and DARPA that have for decades engaged in research and concept development. Offices and departments within Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, such as the Rapid Equipment Force or Expeditionary Warrior Experiment in the U.S. Army, are constantly testing and evaluating unmanned technologies at designated installations and bases. All of the above mentioned institutions cooperate with military contractors. A lot of talk in American unmanned vehicle development is concentrated on white papers, which are constantly released for the public, such as the US Army's Robotic and Autonomous Systems Strategy. This effort is also assisted along the way by technical and policy discussions through various think tanks, federally funded research and development corporations that can assist with concept development and discussion on what is needed for the US military. And of course, there are numerous workshops, symposiums, exhibitions that take place on a regular basis across America that bring together unmanned vehicle developers and government military buyers for discussion into current and future unmanned needs. So all this intellectual, technical, and policy work generates significant public-private, whole-of-government effort that resulted in America's near monopoly on unmanned military systems over the past quarter century. Up until a few years ago, Russia had no official or coordinated policy on unmanned military systems. How to marshal such robotics from their concept and development through testing, evaluation, and eventual acquisition. Multiple companies and and organizations within Russia's military-industrial complex were engaged in uncoordinated and uneven development of such concepts. This has now changed. And this development in particular constitutes the most important aspect of the ongoing and future unmanned military systems development in Russia. In 2014, Russian Ministry of Defense has developed and approved a comprehensive program called Creation of Prospective Military Robotics through 2025. Russian Ministry of Defense also formed a commission for the development of robotics, which is headed by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. The MOD and its military-industrial complex are fully aware of recent trends in robotization, from piloted to semi-autonomous to fully autonomous systems. Artificial intelligence-driven systems that are integrated with manned and unmanned platforms across all battlefield domains are also of great interest. In order to formulate battlefield needs for the next 10 to 20 years and to justify development of military robotics, Russia launched an annual conference in 2016 called Robotization of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. Its objectives include facilitation of dialogue needed to develop new quality of weapons, to improve the effectiveness of Russian combat missions, and to reduce losses among Russian servicemen. The goal of this particular annual event was the development of a unified interdepartmental approaches for the creation and development of military and special purpose robotic complexes, and was attended by numerous representatives from the military, government, and the private sector. Other objectives of this and future public-private whole-of-government effort are the development of practical recommendations on the operation, methods of application, and prospective direction of development of such robotics, generalization of operational experience and application of robotic systems, and analysis of swarm applications for military purposes. This year, Alexander Mironov, which is head of the main directorate for research and technological support for advanced technologies within the Ministry of Defense, spoke at this second conference. And he said that this effort is aimed at creating uniform approaches for the creation and development of military and special purpose complexes in the interest of federal executive bodies, taking into account existing scientific and technical reserve of enterprises of the defense industrial complex. According to him, the Commission for the Ministry of Defense for the Development of Robotic Military Complexes, under the leadership of Ministry of Defense, is working to develop common approaches, reduce the type and variety of models, create common robotic systems, and organize interagency cooperation. Currently, the existing conceptual and policy documents that define the strategy are being clarified. Research and development work is also being carried to create promising concepts within the framework of the State Armaments Order through 2025. In March of this year, Defense Minister Shoigu stated that over the past 3 years, starting with 2014, the military scientific complex of our armed forces has undergone significant changes, and 10 major scientific research institutes and centers have been established to work on information technology, robotics, and unmanned aerial vehicles, together with the Russian Academy of Sciences, higher educational institutions, federal executive bodies, and leading organizations of the defense industrial complex. Basic criteria for key technologies have finally been formulated, as well as priority directions for basic research laid out. The result of this work formed the basis of draft of the new state armaments program, which is currently under discussion. Therefore, Russian Ministry of Defense has a main directorate for research and technological support of advanced technologies. Ministry of Defense also houses the main research center for robotics, launched in 2013. State armaments program through 2025 calls for the development of air and land-based military systems. Standardization of research and development and testing and evaluation for unmanned systems is also underway, such as designating only specific testing sites for the testing of new concepts. In 2013, Russia finally launched its own DARPA, Fond Перспективных Исследований, or the Foundation for Advanced Studies, which also houses a center for development of robotic systems. Finally, exhibitions for new robotic technologies, along with public-private and interagency discussions, are taking place at major exhibitions like previously mentioned MAX. Future trajectory of Russian unmanned military robotics include a growing understanding that such concepts are force multipliers for the country's military. Russia has already used various unmanned platforms in its conflicts, most notably in Syria, and has seen its advantages. Such prospective developments include the following principles: development and use of domestic industrial, electronic, and high-tech components in unmanned systems. Artificial intelligence is becoming a major priority, with President Putin recently stating that the nation that masters AI will get to rule the world. Mid-range and long-range developments in UAVs will accelerate, along with various combat UAVs and new models for ground, underwater, and surface vehicles. Faster concept, development, testing, and evaluation and acquisition cycle is called for. Swarm technology, powered by artificial intelligence, is seen as a significant force multiplier, and many Ministry of Defense and industry officials are drawing attention to this development in public statements, interagency conversations, and finally on the drawing boards of various design bureaus. All these developments and deliberations result in a qualitatively different Russian armed forces today and tomorrow. Even as late as 2008, Russian military looked and operated as it had for decades during the Cold War. Today, Russia is devoting resources and is seeking to marshal the country's intellectual, industrial, and technological potential to create a modern, high-tech, rapidly deployable force capable of extending Moscow's foreign policy goals on the international stage. Would also like to take this time to make two quick announcements. On October 19th, CNA is formally launching a Center for Autonomy and Artificial Intelligence. And on October 10th, I will talk with my counterpart in the Chinese workshop at CNA, and together we will launch a podcast that will be moderated by the head of the newly established center, which will be available a week later. We will talk about development of Russian and Chinese military robotics. Would like to thank the center for giving me the platform, and want to thank you for your attention. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Sam, thanks for a fantastic tour de force to Russia's unmanned systems and drone programs. First, I want to turn to my colleague Olga, who's a longtime Russia watcher and military analyst, to perhaps shed some additional light or put some of this into perspective, if you could.
Absolutely. So, when you're a moderator, you get to ask one or two questions. When you're a discussant, you get to raise all the questions you want to raise, throw in thoughts of your own. It's a beautiful format without actually having to do, the prep and the research and all of that. So what I'm going to do is riff a bit off of what Sam presented to draw a few of the key points out, some of which I think he also highlighted, but I think it's important to highlight, and kind of ask a bit about where this can go. I think one of the things that's really striking about Russian development of autonomous weapon systems is when you look at modernization in the Russian armed forces in general. It's always it's a good PR story, but then as you dig deeper, you realize that a lot of the technology is 1980s technology only just coming online. A lot of the modernization is old systems with a few new bells and whistles. Autonomous systems are an outlier in this, right? That we actually have new technologies being used in new ways. UAVs especially, as Sam described, were just a tremendous catch-up mission where Russia had nothing, was buying them from abroad, and then flurry of development until you actually have stuff that you hear people say that Russia's at the forefront of UAV technology. I mean, that's kind of interesting from a country that isn't known for a very quick development to deployment pipeline. Now, Sam described a little bit about how they've done that, but you want to ask the question of why does it appear to be working here if it doesn't work in other areas? What about this? Is it the technology itself? Is it that catch-up is easier, so there was technology out there? Are these things cheaper to produce and develop and deploy? I think it's a really interesting and important question to ask. How does this actually work? And also, before we get too excited, I do think it's very important to highlight the difference between plans and deployments, right? You can have all sorts of clever ideas on paper, only some of them are actually going to make it to your forces, much less the battlefield. So again, this question of what does that funnel look like and what comes out of the other end of that funnel with all the right ideas, I think is a really, really interesting one. One of Russia's, shall we say, steps forward in the use of autonomous vehicles is the pairing of electronic warfare with UAVs. And as Sam said, that's what the United States would say, oh, well, hey, this is the thing we didn't think of. This isn't quite the revolution in military affairs, right? But it does speak to how perhaps battlefield experience, perhaps creative thinking, perhaps just the matching of different areas of focus. Electronic warfare was something that the Russians have been paying a lot of attention to, thinking of it as an area where they have some advantages that they ought to leverage. As autonomous systems became an area they could use, it might have been natural for them to pair those things in a way that the United States, with its more stovepiped approaches where everything is more or less adequately funded and kind of moves along, you don't necessarily get those synergies right off the bat. So I think that's kind of an interesting story of how the innovation occurs. I'm also struck by the extent to which some of the things we're concerned about in the West aren't looked at in quite the same way today, right? If you look at the concept of military robotics, military robots, artificial intelligence in the United States, you get a certain amount of terror that the killer robots are coming, right? The Terminator doesn't seem like a good idea from here in the United States. It seems like a bad idea. In Russia, there's this notion that this can be controlled, right? That whoever gets AI right is going to rule the world. Well, are they going to rule the world, or are the AIs going to rule the world? What's the theory behind this? Are the fears misplaced? Or is Russia's sense of the ability to control technology misplaced? So the last, my last thought on all of this is this question of how does, which Sam also ended with, how does this get used on the battlefield or on the prospective battlefield? And one of the kind of one of the sayings of the Russian armed forces, one of the core concepts has long been that iron doesn't fight, right? That you need human beings to fight the war. How does that, as a driving concept of operations, square with a reliance on autonomous systems? And I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think for many of us, there's a certain idealism, especially in militaries, that you look at autonomous systems as a way to protect soldiers. Some people also look at aspects of air power that way. That if you have other things that demine, that are subject to risk, you can keep your soldiers, your sailors, and your air folk out of harm's way until such time that you've got a war that's fought entirely by robots and the only human beings at risk are civilians. So is that really how the armed forces of the Russian Federation are thinking about this? I mean, I think that's presumably a long way off. On the other hand, in the last 10 years, we've seen, even the last 5 years, we've seen sufficient developments that maybe it's not as far off as we think. I'll close with that.
Thank you. I'm going to take my privilege as moderator today to ask Sam the first question into our discussion. Sam, so you talked a great deal about what the Russian armed forces have, and I think my personal view I heard is that a lot of it was commercially available technology, licensed production drones from Israel, this sort of thing. It was pretty effective and all good enough. But based on sort of how you see Russian experience from combat operations, from employing these drones, and from having experience of this proliferation, explosion of drones across the Russian military, various different kinds and stripes, all that being said, can you tell us a bit more about what do you think the Russians actually want? Where are they going with drone development? What do you think their lessons learned are from recent years of combat experiences? What kind of systems are they likely to focus on? Because what we basically saw was a menagerie of drones of various different types, many of them actually not theirs and not their designs, and actually older designs from other countries, right, that they've appropriately implemented. But can you tell us where you think the Russian military is going to go likely, and perhaps a little bit about why? And I'll have a question for you as well.
Well, we've seen a lot in open source, in various open sources and media announcements, in press releases, Russia's need for a combat UAV. They're actually behind the curve on that. They're behind Americans, they're behind the Israelis, they're even behind the Chinese, Iranians, and Turks. So there's been a tremendous push to create a domestic combat UAV platform with a range of at least 100 to 150 miles that can perform missions that they've seen Americans perform all across Iraq, Syria. In other words, hitting the enemy as soon as the enemy is identified. That's one. And they're pushing for that development not just with the regular turboprop UAVs, but with the tilt rotors, with the quadrocopters. In other words, they need a combat platform that would be able to adequately support and protect the troops and get the enemy if it's not possible to get them by any other means.
Thank you. And if I can turn to you, so having studied, watched the Russian military for many, many years, I myself almost a bit surprised. It looks like maybe a case of, you know, people who never developed the landline telephone just trying to leapfrog towards the cell phone, right? To pass a whole generation of technology that they never got into, never had. From your perspective on the Russian military, you know, how much or to what extent should the United States, do you think, should be concerned with the introduction of unmanned systems? Are they likely to mirror the United States? Are they likely to instead appropriate them and use them for missions or capabilities and advantages the Russian armed forces traditionally, historically have as a Eurasian land army or heavy area of effect fires army, this sort of thing? What do you think perhaps should be the U.S. takeaways from watching this over the past couple of years?
Right. So I think, you know, as we've discussed, there's a second mover advantage, right? If you're, you know, as both I said, as you said, if you're trying to catch up, you can use off-the-shelf stuff, you can emulate, you can reverse engineer, and you know, you don't have to go through everything that the first mover had to go through. I think so. Russia has that advantage in developing these systems. And in part because so much of this is available commercially, you don't even have the classification concerns, right? If you have to get the system and you have to reverse engineer it, you buy it. And you know, reverse engineer it, that it's not secret. You don't have to send your spies out. I think what's interesting is because Russia, for two reasons. One, because Russia has a tradition of trying to think very creatively, sometimes so creatively as, you know, so far out of the box that you can't even see the box from there, about technologies. They do sometimes hit on things and ways of using forces and ways of developing synergies that the United States, for all of its DARPAs and so forth, doesn't, because we don't always integrate the technology with the way the fighting force works, right? We have a tendency to think of the technology as an add-on, as a force multiplier, but without thinking very creatively about what it can do and what those combinations are, right? I mean, I mentioned the Revolution of Military Affairs. I mean, this is a great example, and Dima Damsky in Israel has done fantastic work on this, looking at the US develops a technology. The Russians figure out what you can do with it, but they can't develop the technology or deploy it. The Israelis just do it, but they never write it up. So the question is, will the Russians start just doing it and perhaps writing it up, perhaps not writing it up, because they're in the field, They have limited resources. They're trying to make the best use of what they've got. This is actually an environment that can be useful for innovation. So I think from the Kremlin standpoint, from the MOD standpoint, a lot of it is about emulation. A lot of it is about the United States can do this, we're going to try to do it. But I think where you're going to see the creativity is from people coming in the field and coming back from the field. I mean, you're seeing this in Ukraine from both the Russians and the Russian-backed separatists and the Russians that back them, and the Ukrainians, where people come up with clever ways to use things, and they fiddle with them, right? They hack them. And I think that's where you're going to see interesting innovations in this field as well.
Right. Innovation on the battlefield. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. Just please briefly introduce yourself when you make your comment, and please have it be a question and not an additive point from the floor if you could. I'm going to start with Dave.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk, Sam.
Yeah, please wait for that microphone.
Thanks for the great talk, Sam. I'm David Knoll from the Center for Naval Analysis. So you mentioned innovation and groups that are resource constrained being the mother of innovation. Well, there's another group out there that I think is emulating the United States, and that's ISIS. At the tactical level, they're using lots of UAVs. Their development has been rapid in the last 2 years. Is there anything the Russians can learn from ISIS in terms of using technology not as a standalone, but to facilitate their operations in the field?
Sam?
We've seen some Russian promotional videos that show small quadricopters dropping bombs and rockets. So clearly they've been monitoring what ISIS has done. They were concerned with what ISIS was doing. They were probably just as shocked as Americans and others as to how quickly ISIS was able to innovate. So they're paying very close attention to what that terrorist organization has done.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Right here, John.
Hi, my name is Daniel Siebel. I'm here at CSIS as an intern with the Missile Defense Project. My question is, you spent a lot of time today talking about the offensive capabilities that they're developing. What about defeat capabilities, right? Because that seems to be where this technology is going. If we're going to have these implemented in the field, how do we combat them? Are we going to see, swarms of UAVs facing off? Could you explain or explore some of those possibilities?
Missile defense people want to hear about defense.
Yeah.
Sam.
Well, Russia has a very robust electronic warfare system. It's got numerous platforms. It's probably years ahead of everybody else in the field. So to Russians, the first line of defense would be probably electronic warfare, suppress and destroy the communication signals. Various Russian military enterprises are developing counter-UAS portable platforms like the rifles and others. So there's a lot of development in that field as well. Russian specialists are talking about the creation of shrapnel-like or small portable missile defense-like concept that would be able to blow those UAVs out of the sky if any penetrate. But you're absolutely right. Swarm UAVs powered by AI are of extreme concern to the Russian military establishment because it is capable of penetrating their missile defenses.
I'll just add, since we're talking about missile defenses and since we're talking about swarms, I just had this vision of chaff UAVs coming in. So you include in your swarm a lot of things that aren't actually the target, so that if you do have somebody who's trying to defend against you, they're hitting a lot of stuff that's useless. Mm-hmm. You could get you could get a lot of money for this.
Mm-hmm. So right there, impatient.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. When I hear people like former Deputy Secretary Work talking about international comparisons, I get a two-phase concern. I want to see what you believe is actually the reality or perhaps the extra anxiety behind this. One, that the Russians, as you said, lack our concern about Terminators. They're much more willing to let autonomous systems loose with authority to use weapons without a human in the loop. And B, therefore, because they're going to do that and we aren't, as Frank Kendall actually said, there is a chance that they might leapfrog us. And even though their technology may have started out behind, their lack of scruples lets them do things more effectively than we do. A, is that true about the Russians' attitude? And B, whether it's their attitude or not, is their technology so far behind us that it doesn't matter?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the AI as a concept is a fairly new thing for Russians to consider. And until recently, there have been a lot of public statements by military officials saying that, listen, we're not that comfortable with a military weapon making decisions of its own. And even now, in the majority of discussions, the human is in the loop. What they understand is that the threat the high-tech threat that they consider from NATO, from the West, maybe from somebody else, is going to come across numerous domains, from space to air to sea to cyber, etc. And humans may not be able to make those decisions, defensive decisions, fast enough. Therefore, they need to step up their AI development to counter that, or at least augment their human decision making. But this discussion is still at the initial stages. This is not an advanced conversation within the Russian MOD.
I'd throw in the question of why do you think scruples lead you to want a human being in the loop? It's not as though human beings are known for making the best possible decisions under pressure and in difficult circumstances. Having said that, I would say that Russians aren't usually all that comfortable with individual humans making decisions, right? Mm-hmm. The devolution of authority is not a thing that the Russian military has consistently embraced. And that's not because they're evil, right? It's because of different ways of approaching military command and control, decision making, and so forth. So, I think this is something they're going to wrestle with. I think the trust in AIs is based on the idea that you can control them. It's not based on the idea that we're going to trust them and they're going to be okay. For all that I may think that AIs may be at least as good, if not better, than human beings in making decisions, I strongly doubt that someone feels that way.
Thank you. Thank you,
I was going to ask something sort of similar, so I'll follow on one. Are there any key pieces? Oh, sorry, Pat Tucker with Defense One. Are there any key pieces of doctrine that sort of inform how Russia would use military robots separate from the way the U.S. would use them? We have a doctrine that, of course, says humans have to be on the loop, moving away from in the loop in terms of lethal decision making. Is there anything like that within the Russian military, or is there a document that says here's what limitations we should impose, and or is it too early?
Well, these discussions are finally taking place. I mentioned a conference, Robotization of the Armed Forces, and at that conference, government officials, MOD officials, private sector, academia are discussing that. There hasn't been an official document, but the Russians have codified the need for military robotics in their state armaments program and other documents. But no, at least in the open sources, we haven't seen that yet.
Thank you, Sam. Are you right there? By the way, we have plenty of time. Don't worry, I will get to your question. Since our speakers are being very generous and making concise answers, unlike me when I am usually up here, that's probably why we have so many questions being asked.
That's why we made you
moderate. I know. So I would not contaminate this discussion with my own thoughts on Russian drones. I got it.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. I'm Lisa Aronson with the Congressional Research Service and Atlantic Council. I just had a question. One of the goals of the third offset and then the restructuring of the Pentagon AT&L was to give acquisition more organizational flexibility to leverage breakthroughs that are taking place in the transnational commercial academic space. How do you assess Russia's sort of organizational acquisition flexibility? How quickly can they get commercial technologies into doctrine and into their military system compared with us and the Chinese, perhaps?
Well, I've mentioned several discussions that Russians are having about streamlining this process, about making sure that only so many models are produced that are tested at certain locations. In other words, they're looking for standards and they're looking for streamlining that effort. That is at the initial stages, essentially. We're still ways off from saying, well, they will get this done in a number of years. But the fact that they are having this discussion is already important because, as we've indicated, they're going from 0 to 100 in 6 seconds when it comes to UAVs. So the process of acquisition, logistics, is still catching up to the actual creation of UAVs, of which Russia, or unmanned systems in general, of which Russians have many.
In general, private-public partnerships in the defense sphere have been very difficult for Russia. So what they can do is buy the technology if it already exists, or identify it and try to develop it in the military context if the military doesn't have it and it needs its very own version, which of course takes a lot longer than cutting a deal. I mean, they have not done well. They've tried to spin off from military companies into the civilian world. They've tried to figure out how to work with civilian firms. It's been a challenge for them. So I think that you raise a very good question, that I think this is going to be a stumbling block for Russia.
Great question. Mike?
Mike Connell, CNA. Quick question, Sam. You touched on the collaboration aspect, the fact that the Orlan's produced under license with the Israelis, the similarities with the Shahed 129 with the Iranians and the Russian counterpart. Where does collaboration fit in this future Russian plan? Do you see increased collaboration with other potential allies, or do you see them kind of trying to become more autonomous and develop their own systems independently?
Well, they're still dependent on the Farpost, which is an Israeli-made searcher UAV for their future operations. They're seeking to deep modernize it, as they call it, and produce a domestic version of it. I think for certain platforms, that's still going to be the case. So Farpost represents a significant Russian ISR lead by giving them a long-range view on the battlefield. For other systems, that's kind of hard to say. In fact, some Russians are calling for import of Chinese UAVs. After all, so much Russian military technology floats south of the border. Why not acquire latest Chinese models? I've mentioned that Orion and Shahed look very much alike, and they really do. Again, there's no open evidence of such cooperation, although Iranians travel to Moscow on a regular basis, so perhaps they shared that concept within their current and ongoing cooperation on Syria. But for other models and for other designs, Russia wants a robust domestic industry. They don't like the fact that they had to depend on imports. Russia imports another UAV, which is Zastava. It was one of the smaller ones, also an Israeli model. They understood that that's what they needed to do at the time. But after all, this is Russia. They make all kinds of military equipment. They should be able to make unmanned systems as well. So there's a very big push right now for the domestic manufacturing.
Gentleman right here.
Steve Winters, I'm an independent consultant. You didn't speak particularly about the networking aspect of this whole scenario. I remember the defense minister showed you giving a tour of the Russian Pentagon that you showed a picture of, and saying that we have 3 times the supercomputing power here as the U.S. Pentagon in D.C. has. And of course, all of their strikes and everything going on in Syria is sent up there, the information coordinated up there. So presumably, even if you're talking about autonomous robots, it's not that they're going to be operating independently. They'll probably be all in some super network or Skynet type operation. That's certainly the U.S. concept. So perhaps you could say something about that aspect, about what I guess the Chinese call the informatization of the battle space.
That's a great question. Russians inaugurated their National Defense Coordination Center only 3 years ago. The goal for that center is actually this coordination of all major military aspects of Russian domestic and overseas operations, including acquisition, coordination with military-industrial complex. Yes, UAV operations, or rather unmanned systems operations, are not going to be done independently. They will probably be channeled via various command centers and would be done, if not from NDCC proper, but through its various smaller affiliates across the country. But again, we haven't seen much discussion about that yet. NDCC is still getting its sea legs. They're still kind of working out the kinks. They make very substantial claims, absolutely, but those claims are yet to be proven.
More questions? Back to Pat. Sorry if I missed anybody in the back. I'm going to look harder for the back rows.
Thanks. Patrick Tucker, still with Defense One. One aspect of the sanctions that we imposed on Russia in the end of last year was prohibition, not just financial sanctions, but also a prohibition on transfer of sensitive technologies and dual-use technologies. Have the sanctions had any effect on the development of Russian either weapons technology or particularly artificial intelligence? Thanks.
In short, yes. I mentioned Altius long-range UAV that's currently delayed. It was originally slated to fly with imported engines. Other smaller UAVs operated with imported engines as well. So Russians have taken some time to import substitute that. So yes, there has been effect. Has not been a substantial effect. After all, most of unmanned systems used in Syria, for example, are smaller models that could be easily made by not just a military-industrial factory, but even by a Russian university. And in fact, that has happened. I didn't touch upon the fact that on the civilian side, there's also a lot of development, And many departments of aviation and various Russian universities are also working to design various UAVs for the civilian sector, including engines and electronics.
And just to jump in on that, Sam, as far as I know, Israel's not participating in the U.S. sanctions regime against Russia. That's not really affected the drone cooperation.
That's a very special relationship.
So if key players that develop drones are not at all part of the sanctions regime, that kind of has part of the answer right there.
Well, it depends on which pieces you're looking at, right? If you're looking for engines, that might be a broader thing than it can have an effect. But on the other hand, lots of people make engines. So.
Right.
More questions? Sydney here.
Sidney Friedberg, I am too still with breaking defense. The media industry is in trouble, but not so much trouble we change jobs in between questions. I hope.
Have you checked your Twitter in the last 10 minutes?
Have you been live tweeting this?
To follow up on my earlier question, something especially you, Dr. Olikov, said, something work wasn't particularly emphatic about was, we Americans will use this technology to empower our individuals, our junior folks, our NCOs, whereas, the authoritarians like Russia and China, as you said, are not comfortable with human beings making decisions at those levels, let alone robotics, so they're going to have a more top-down, centralized approach, and ours will be superior. So again, A, do you think that's a fair depiction of the Russian cultural position for using these in a centralized way? And B, is it actually having an effect on how they use these, or again, are they in the field actually using it in a fairly centralized way?
Okay, two-part question.
Yeah, so not necessarily, simply because Russians are pushing unmanned systems, especially UAVs, down to the platoon and company level. So they want every major grouping of soldiers to operate their own ISR, situational awareness tool. As far as talking about the top-down approach, well, again, the jury's still out. Yes, United States has a slightly different outlook, but Russians look at the United States, they look at Israel, and they look at other nations that have been successful in fielding unmanned systems, and they want to replicate that as well. So decision-making is something that Russians are discussing right now. How do we better allocate such decision-making with these unmanned platforms from the very tactical to the strategic levels?
Good answer. Would you like to add?
Yeah, no, I don't know that I have much to add. I think it is a question of whether Russia will shift to less centralized command and control. Not to put too fine a point on it, it's a tough sell. On the other hand, as they professionalize their military, as they move away from reliance on conscripts, as they train their forces better, that might be less, that might come to seem less crazy to Russian commanders, right? If you've got capable, trained people, you trust them more than if you don't.
Right, because historically it's not because it's not that the Russians are evil, they want boss them around, it's because their conscripts were illiterate.
Right, well, I don't think their conscripts have been illiterate for quite some time, really quite some time, but possibly longer than since our conscripts have been illiterate. Russia has good literacy rates, you gotta give them that.
Yeah.
I think it's a complicated cultural thing, right? The Russians don't like trusting their submarine commanders. They want to have contact with them. They want to be able to tell them what to do. I think this is a very strong cultural predilection. At the same time, they are shifting the way they think about warfighting. So how this particular aspect of it shifts, I think, will be interesting to watch.
And just a cultural note, Russians, well, this may or may not be true, but they claim that they were the first to use unmanned aerial systems in combat because in the 10th century, one of the Russian princesses attached burning threads to a group of, a flock of swallows who...
The Ukrainian princess.
Well, Slavic. And so they flew the birds flew into the homes of the enemy town and completely burned it down. This was replicated by various Mongolian rulers as they tried to conquer China. So there's a lot of cultural aspects
great
here.
hearts and minds operation right there.
Very much so. Very much so. And again, until recently...
I think that would be considered a war crime now. Yeah.
Until recently, there's been various levels of discomfort within the Russian military with using UAVs. After all, they were very few, they were expensive machines, and a lot of commanders were really concerned that if they lost that UAV in operation, it would be their ass on the line. That's changing now that UAVs are increasing at all levels of operation, from tactical to strategic. I mentioned on one of the slides that the number of UAVs has increased tenfold in Russia, from over 100 some 6 years ago to over 2,000, and that number is probably going to rise exponentially.
The gentleman in the back has a question.
Hi there, guys. Sam Baines. America's famous for, well, not famous, but like well known amongst the defense industry that DARPA might create and fund the same thing 5 times, and the bureaucracy slows things down and for getting it into the field, etc. How is Russia's culture and bureaucracy affect how quickly, once it makes its mind up, it can get it into the field and therefore accelerate past America, Israel, etc. once it decides to set a plan in place?
Well, Michael mentioned several times in his discussions that Ministry of Defense is one of the most competent bureaucracies across the country right now. And they've shown that they can adapt quickly if there's a need for that. We've seen that with Syrian Express, the logistics train to Tartus. We've seen that in other concepts. So today, knowing what unmanned systems are, what advantage they carry, knowing how much Russia needs to modernize, Ministry of Defense is probably at the forefront of that sort of logistics, acquisition, and decision-making cycles. Now, there are systemic issues with the military-industrial complex and with the lack of certain high-tech electronic components, with the lack of knowledge amongst the personnel. But once the mind is made up, there's a fairly good amount of energy at the top to push the decision-making down for the eventual resolution of the problem.
I might disagree with that a little bit. I think the MOD is a fairly efficient decision-making process. The military-industrial complex is one of the least efficient implementation systems. I mean, in the world, maybe. I think military-industrial complexes in general, right? They are designed to suck money out of the government. That's really what they're for, and the Russian military-industrial complex is no different. They have huge firms that are still unreformed, that are still inefficient. A lot of people need to get their salaries paid. They need to be supported. They need to be fed. There's a lot of money that needs to be skimmed off and sent off to Cyprus. There's a lot of room for inefficiency, and the inefficiency happens. Now, if there is a direct order from the top that this is a top priority, the odds go up a bit. But the Russian defense industry delivers slowly and over budget, just like every other defense industry.
They're efficient at sucking off the money. They're just inefficient at producing the thing that the money was meant for, right?
Sometimes they're not even efficient at sucking off the money.
But yeah, I want to briefly stay on this issue a bit more because, Sam, perhaps you could tell, as you were earlier describing, a number of these drone systems that were essentially literally bought from other countries or licensed, produced from other countries. Would you see that as a sign that early on, at some point, the Russian Ministry of Defense got frustrated that the defense industrial complex couldn't produce their own drones? Otherwise, they wouldn't be having Israeli and Croatian drones if they could have made their own drones, right? That's kind of like, to me, one of the first signs that they can't produce. And then at some point, something happened, and now we do see all these Russian drones, although albeit still pretty simple base, commercially accessible technology. But would you argue that one spurred the other, one was a clear sign of frustration with their own inability to produce it early on?
The short answer is yes. In fact, I mentioned Altair's design. That's a long-range UAV that's over budget and underperformed. Today, news broke that federal authorities actually entered the factory that is supposed to produce this UAV and have removed its director because of financial irregularities. So there are a lot of issues within the military-industrial complex.
Shocked.
As we have mentioned, Russians saw a distinct advantage at very quickly acquiring a system and learning from its operations. And obviously, Israelis knew that that was going to happen. But Russians have learned well, as we have seen with a large number of various unmanned systems already in operation and in training.
Good answer. Okay. More questions on the floor? Oh, lady right there.
Thanks so much. Really interesting presentation. I'm Elsa Kania, an adjunct fellow with the Center for New American Security, and it seems that to date, Russian efforts in military robotics are considerably less advanced than China's, which is ironic because Chinese military acquired its first UAV from Russia and then reverse engineered it in the 60s, I believe. So I was curious if you see, you mentioned that Russia's been reluctant to acquire foreign drones or commercial drones despite the tremendous success of the Chinese UAV industry. Do you see any likelihood of cooperation there? Would they be more willing to acquire high-end Chinese systems? Is there a potential they could follow another Chinese strategy there and attempt to leverage commercial cyber espionage to acquire some of the relevant IP and then try to reverse engineer it? Or be curious to hear more about how you see some of the dynamics there in terms of developments going forward.
It's a great question, and I've mentioned earlier that some Russian analysts and officials are calling for the importation of Chinese designs. After all, so much of Russian technology went to the Chinese. We haven't seen a lot of those statements at the official levels, and they're not coming from the government or from the Ministry of Defense that we need to import Chinese CH-4s and CH-5 and other combat UAVs. To the point where China has the advantage. China has the advantage with combat systems, and that's true. And they very quickly rallied and manufactured what the market demanded. But Russia has other systems. Its smaller UAVs are actually used very widely. In fact, after Syria, Russians are claiming that there is a lot of interest in their machines, and Russians are saying they received no less than 50 requests for Russian UAV exports. So this can go either way. Cooperation with China is an ongoing issue. I'm not an expert on Russian-Chinese cooperation, although we do have a colleague who is studying that. And the question about importation of Chinese UAVs to Russia, I think, is an open-ended one, but it's an excellent one too.
You just jump to piggyback. Do you think there might be a pride issue of sort of Soviet and then Soviet-inherited Russian sort of science technological complex being a superpower and former great power and always having lived alongside the Chinese, which are always technologically less advanced in military science for a long time?
It's okay to borrow technology from
Right.
the Israelis, but not from the
Right.
Chinese.
Exactly.
Is there a pride issue of living next to this other power and not wanting to acknowledge that actually they're more advanced than you in a particular field of science, and not wanting to make that obvious by having to import their tech? Is that an issue or not in this case? Why is it okay to buy from Croatia but not China?
You know, it's a great question. We originally wanted to invite a Russian UAV expert, Denis Fedutinov, but the visa issues between our two countries.
We did, in fact, invite him.
Yeah.
He just couldn't get a visa in time because
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think if he
we
was
shut down the visa process.
If you follow U.S.-Russia relations, you know why.
if he was here, he would probably answer that question
We
more accurately.
will try to get him here as soon as he gets a visa.
But it's not a question of pride. I think it's a question of what the military was capable of absorbing at that time. After all, Israel has been around for less than 7 decades, and China has been around for thousands of years. I think it's an issue of a relationship, political advantages, and other aspects beyond military which played into that acquisition.
Okay. All right, more questions? All right, should we give Sydney one more?
Someone in the back.
How are we doing on time?
We have a question in the back.
There we go. I see a hand.
How you doing? My name's Greg Smith. I'm in the United States Navy. Dima Adamski's comparison of culture and innovation, basically, I think, to summarize, he said that Russians come up with the theory and the doctrine earlier, whereas the U.S. does technology first, and Israel tends to experiment. If that line of reasoning still holds, what do we know about Russian theory and doctrine on this? Is that an indication of where they're going rather than chasing the technology? Because in that area, they're obviously a little bit behind.
That's still in development. I mentioned various conferences that bring together this whole of government, public, private approach. So they're actually gaming that out. But when it comes to the United States, for example, we have both the practice and the theory. We manufactured UAVs and UGVs and UUVs, and we've actually used them extensively. We've been using unmanned aerial vehicles in Iraq and Afghanistan and around the world for over a decade and a half. So Russians are definitely paying attention to what the technology leaders are doing, and they are currently trying to formulate their own theory of use and theory of practice with unmanned systems.
So Adamski's theory and what he describes is based on revolution military affairs. It's based in large part on deep strike, right? If you have systems that can go deep into enemy territory, the Russians have been thinking about deep strike since the 30s. That's immediately what they think of when they see that you have the ability to reach far. It also had a lot to do with the fact that they weren't actually fighting wars, and they couldn't afford to build the technology, right? So they could see the technology, they could think about what you could do with it, they could come up with some really clever ideas. What we're looking at here is a little bit different because the Russians are fighting wars and they are fielding some of this. They're resource constrained. They're certainly looking at how the United States is using it, with or without a theory of how, but I mean, I think this is something that's worth watching, but it's not as clean as Adamski's cases, because they were very clean, which is why his book works so well. But the reality of it, I mean, I think these cultures do have a real effect. The Russians do tend to overthink and overanalyze, but it's rare that that comes out with one clear hypothesis of how things work. And when it does, and I think this also is very ably demonstrated in Adamski's book, a lot of it has to do with historical views of warfare, right? So it's not just that they see the technology and they figure out a clever new way to do it. They figure out an approach that is rooted in how they think about conflict in the first place. And I think that's another thing to think about when the Russians think about the use of autonomous systems. How is that going to fit in with traditional Russian approaches to warfare?
Makes sense. Oh, we have one more question. I think we have to repeat that.
Hi, Elsa Caney again. So to go off of that question in terms of innovation and potentially unique Russian uses of these systems, one of the most interesting unmanned systems that I thought you mentioned was the Lear-3, or the RB-341B, and its use both in electronic warfare and in psychological warfare through conveying different forms of media. I would be curious to hear a little bit more about that and how they've been using it, any sort of adaptation or innovation in terms of how it's been employed, and whether you see that as perhaps indicative of the potential uniqueness of Russia's approach and how they are approaching unmanned systems in concert with their thinking on information operations and psychological warfare, and any other examples like that that seem to be a little bit orthogonal to how the US military has used UAVs. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, fast forward to a few years from now, and Russians are probably going to have several UAV or unmanned aerial vehicle platforms capable of carrying electronic warfare. So there's a lot of investment in that capability across Russian military. Lear-3 in particular is a fairly new concept, but the Russians have been training with Lear-3 for a number of years now. The previous models have been modified, and the one that we're seeing today is capable of suppressing several cell phone towers at once, affecting up to 2,000 subscribers. People won't notice when their cell phones switch. Once that happens, this electronic warfare, UAV-borne electronic warfare system can deliver text messages, videos, and others to the cell phone subscribers. So this is definitely a forward-thinking concept. It's a close-range concept. Orlans don't have a long range. They fly in twos or threes so that one serves as a relay for the signal from the truck. Russians are probably looking to expand that capability, and as I mentioned, other platforms will be able to carry electronic warfare. Imagine the situation if such technology is based on a long-range UAV that is capable of attacking the potential adversary 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers from Russia's center.
Great answer. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this discussion. I think we've done a great job today covering the issue. Sam, I want to thank you kindly for what was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And Olga, of course, for both participating in the discussion and allowing me to serve as guest moderator here at CSIS.
Anytime.
Thank you.
You did an excellent job as moderator.
Okay, thanks a lot.